Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Rural Rapport. My name is Teresa Hoffman. I'm the Senior Communications Associate here at the Center for Rural Affairs. Today, we'll be discussing the Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota legislative sessions. Joining me are Kate Hansen, a Policy Associate, and Tim Mussack and Heidi Kolbeck-Urlacher, our Senior Policy Associates. Kate, let's start with you. The Iowa session is still going on. Can you share a little bit about what the center's priorities are this year?
Absolutely. Thanks, Teresa. I would say our priorities kind of fall into three buckets here in Iowa. One is water and flooding, water quality, those type of issues. Another is clean energy, which this year has focused a lot on solar energy, and also development, small meat processing, local foods, that type of legislation. And your point is very true. We are still in session. There are a number of debates between the chambers that are still ongoing and frankly hitting some heated points. And so we're not sure when we'll wrap up, but today is our 100th day, which means that's when the legislators per diem their expenses end for things like gas and lodging to get to Des Moines. So usually that means the end is in sight, but this year we're not quite sure quite yet.
What water and energy legislation did the center weigh in on, and what remains viable at this time?
Yes, so earlier on in the session, there was a lot of discussion about tax legislation and changing the taxes in Iowa through a tax package. And so when that was going on, there was an opportunity in some legislation to fund IWIL, which is the trust fund essentially that would fund a lot of outdoor recreation and natural resources efforts. And in there was language that had opportunity for watershed management authorities, which is an entity we're very supportive of. And so when that was on the table, we were very supportive of that section and encouraging legislators to pass that. Unfortunately, it didn't make it into the final tax package, but we still are supporting those WMAs. We brought some advocates to the Capitol a few weeks back to talk with lawmakers, to talk with some of the agencies, and we actually had over an hour in that room with some good conversations. So we're still pushing on that. There is a Senate Study Bill 3157 that includes some of those features from that original tax package, which we're registered in support of. And then there are two pretty exciting bills in the renewable energy space. They're companion bills related to the Iowa solar tax credit. This was a tax credit last year that essentially would support Iowans who were installing solar energy for a number of reasons. And there are people on what is sort of known as the wait list that were assumed to be getting that tax credit and have not gotten it. And so these bills, it's House File 2556 and Senate File 2326. They would essentially pay out that wait list for a price tag of about 5 million, 5.6, I think. And we see that as a pretty cost-effective solution for the legislature to keep its promise to Iowans. Those two bills are still viable and we're watching them through the process.
You mentioned small meat processing was one of the center's priorities going into the session, and local foods as well. Talk about that legislation. Are there bills that are still out there that are viable?
Yes, we do have a couple of exciting bills that we're watching still viable. Two are related to some legislation that actually passed last year. Some may remember the Butchery Innovation and Revitalization Program that the center was very supportive of in 2021. That was a grants program and also a task force that was created to support Iowa's small meat processors. So those two bills are related to funding for that grants program and then the recommendations of that task force. So in terms of funding, there's a package, an appropriations package, House File 2564, that currently lists that grants program of a $1 million appropriation, which is a $250,000 increase from last year. So we're very supportive of that. There was a lot of demand for that program. If I'm remembering correctly, there were over 70 applicants and only 15 or so got funded. So we know there's a demand, and seeing that increased funding would be really great. There's also House File 2470, and is essentially taking a series of recommendations that task force put together. This was a group of processors and industry professionals. They put together some recommendations And this House file would kind of put them into motion. Among other things, it would create a butchery education program at a community college to sort of create and sustain the next generation of this workforce. So we're really supportive of those two bills and watching them closely. And we're also registered in support of House File 2581, which has some details related to the local food and farm program, which we're supportive of.
Well, great. Well, thanks, Kate, for providing that update on the Iowa session. And if you would like to stay up to date on the remaining week or weeks of the session, feel free to go to our website, cfra.org. We have our legislative updates will be posted on there until the end of the session. Turning to Nebraska, this was Nebraska's 60-day session, 60 working days, and it is set to end Wednesday. Wednesday is basically set up as a day if there's any gubernatorial veto votes that need to be taken, and just kind of a day to wrap up the session. So that will be tomorrow. Tim joins us to talk a little bit about the Nebraska session. Tim, share what the Center's Nebraska policy priorities were going into the session.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks, Teresa. So in Nebraska, if you would read our unicameral update, you'd see we kind of supported 15 bills this year. But out of those 15, I think 3, maybe 4 priorities really stick out to me for the center. And the first one would be LB 755, or Legislative Bill 755. We helped draft the bill, and we really pushed for it this year and put a lot of effort into it. And it ended up passing under Legislative Bill 1014, which ended up being the American Rescue Plan Act spending bill for Nebraska. The bill was introduced by Senator Tom Brandt and funds $10 million for the Independent Processor Assistance Program, which is a program that will provide financial assistance for small meat processors to upgrade equipment, train employees, build new facilities, even with the ultimate goal of increasing the amount of meat that they can process. It's important to rural communities and small towns that rely on small meat processors to process their own animals that they're either going to feed their family with, or maybe small livestock producers that sell meat directly to consumers as part of a business. It's important for them to be able to get their animals processed in a timely manner. And over the past couple of years, the wait time to get an animal processed in some cases has grown to 1 or even 2 years that you have to kind of plan out before you can get into a meat locker. So ultimately, we hope this legislation and this money over time will kind of bring down that wait time and be good for our rural communities. And it's really a follow-up bill from last year's session when the center helped get past LB 324, which created the herd share program, and it also created the Independent Processor Assistance Program. Kind of the missing piece from last year was getting funding. So this year with the ARPA dollars, we saw an opportunity to get this program funded and kind of finish out some unfinished business from last year. And, and that's not to say that, LB 324 last year was passed unanimously, and that's not to say that this funding was easy to do this year. It's always hard to ask the legislature for money in Nebraska. And even with all the ARPA dollars that was able to be appropriated, a lot of requests went unfunded this year. So I think it really says a lot to the work that we did this year, organizing over 50 small meat processors and really getting stakeholders in the state to show up to the committee hearing was a big part of our success. I know that in Nebraska, every bill gets a public hearing, and it's really important for senators to hear, stories from, real people in Nebraska that will be impacted by legislation. And we facilitated, I believe the final number was 8 first-time testifiers, and it can be a scary process for some people to go in front of the legislature and testify, so it was really a great thing to get some of those key stakeholders in the state to come to Lincoln and let senators know how the funding will impact them and be good for their community. And I think that had a lot to do with our success in this situation. So I previously mentioned 3 bills total. So the next 2 bills that were really priorities for the center kind of go together. It's LB 759 and LB 1090, and they both help small businesses. LB 1090 increases the amount of appropriations for the micro enterprise assistance program from $2 million to $3 million. And then LB 759, which is the other part of the bill, increases the amount of loans that you can give out under that program from $100,000 to $150,000. And the micro enterprise assistance program is used by community lenders like the Center for Rural Affairs to give business loans to small businesses that are growing or starting. And also, the money can be used for no cost technical assistance for people that may or may not know exactly what they need to do to grow their business. And it's one program of 5 total under the Business Innovation Act in Nebraska, which has really helped grow small businesses in Nebraska. So it was great to see that the legislature kind of acknowledged that the program is helping small businesses and rural communities in the state, and kind of double down on supporting the program. And in LB 759 that increased the loan amount from 100 to 150,000. That number hasn't been updated since 2015. And since 2015, things have only gotten more expensive. So it's good to see that number come up. Without that increase, lenders would see people need loans for above $100,000. So because it was capped at 100,000, business owners would then have to go to a second lender to finish out their loan. So it kind of made the process really inefficient from both a lender and a client perspective. So it's another good thing just to make the program more usable and ultimately be able to help more business owners. So I guess the theme for Nebraska really, from the center's perspective with those 3 bills, was helping small businesses grow. And with 755, the Independent Processor Assistance Program, it'll help those small businesses grow, which has a positive effect on rural communities that use their services.
Well, great. Thanks, Tim, for sharing that information about Nebraska. As you mentioned, the American Rescue Plan Act, or the ARPA funding, was a big part of the session. Anything else on that funding, Tim, that you wanted to add? Yeah, sure. So going into the session, we expected that lawmakers were going to have to make some really tough decisions. And in that, combined with, you mentioned earlier, the 60-day session, so a short session. Normally in a 60-day session, the legislature does not tackle budget issues. So we were a little concerned going in, wondering if the legislature could fit everything in this year, and they did a great job. And then so in Nebraska, it was decided that the ARPA dollars would go through like a mini budget process. So Governor Ricketts and his staff did introduce a bill with their recommendations for how to spend the money. Of course, other senators also introduced bills with requests on how to allocate the $1 billion in ARPA funding. And then the Appropriations Committee did a public hearing on every single request. So they really did a lot of heavy lifting this year. And took some of the governor's recommendations and took some of the recommendations from other senators, and ultimately presented, the ARPA budget package. And our hard work can also kind of be quantified. And Senator Stinner, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, mentioned on the floor that they had estimated around $4 billion was requested from ARPA allocations, and they only had $1 billion to actually allocate. So, a lot of people asked for funding this year and, didn't get the funding approved. So that's another reason I think the center should be, really proud of getting that $10 million for small meat processors in this case. All right, well, turning to South Dakota's session wrapped up in mid-March. Heidi is joining us to talk a little bit about the session there in South Dakota. What kinds of bills was the center watching during that session, Heidi?
Well, thanks, Teresa. So energy is always a priority for us in the bills that we watch here in South Dakota, but it was a very quiet session on the energy front. We did see a couple of kind of themes that were coming up that we were watching, and one would be around the governance of solar facilities. And the other was around electric vehicles. So we did watch several bills that were introduced as a way to bring governance of solar facilities kind of in line with what's already in place with wind turbines. South Dakota is getting its first 2 utility size solar facilities. And so we're just kind of bringing those ordinances up. And one that passed is Senate Bill 36, which basically added solar to the Public Utility Commission's authority of being able to require financial security for those projects. And the reason that that's important is that when the Public Utilities asks for that funds, it means that those financial securities are set aside for the purpose of decommissioning those projects. And so we know from local communities that there is some concern over projects being abandoned. And so this just provides that extra assurance that there's funding available to decommission these projects already, ahead of time. So we did see that bill pass. Related to electric vehicles, we saw House Bill 1093 was an update to a bill that passed for the first time last year that added a fee to electric vehicles. And this is an annual fee, and the purpose of this was to replace the lost funds that generally would be brought in through the gas tax. And those funds are used to go into the highway maintenance, road repair, those sort of things. So it's important funding, and we understand why they developed this annual fee. It passed last year at $50, and so they're really just barely seeing this money start to trickle in. However, there was a bill introduced to raise that up to $250, but we saw some pretty strong opposition to that. There wasn't a lot of information about whether that was a good number or not. And there wasn't a lot of justification for raising it at this point. So we probably will see this issue revisited in the future, but right now that bill was defeated. The other piece of legislation that we saw related to electric vehicles was Senate Bill 80, which basically allowed electric vehicle charging stations to be exempted from the definition of an electric utility. So this is a little bit in the weeds, but basically any sort of entity that is selling electricity generally would be defined as a utility, and therefore be subject to a whole host of regulations that are quite complicated and very constraining. And so exempting electric vehicle charging stations from that definition of a utility will simplify the process of allowing those stations to be built. And this will be very helpful, as we know there is a very large push to get more electric vehicle charging stations all across the state out into rural areas and really available for everyone. And so this will hopefully streamline that process and allow for just simplification of the rules around those electric vehicle charging stations.
Thanks, Heidi. What were some of the other priorities?
So there were several bills that we provided comment on this year that were kind of a follow-up to bills that we engaged with last year. And the first of that being an allocation of $50 million toward broadband infrastructure build out. And so the state last year passed a bill using $75 million from the general fund for rural broadband infrastructure grants. And they also utilized $25 million in coronavirus relief funding for that purpose as well, for a total of $100 million. This year, they appropriated $50 million from ARPA funding, and that will allow the state to recover some of the funds from the general fund that were allocated last year. And so we are applauding the continued focus on broadband build out in the state. We know it is an important and necessary need, particularly in rural areas. And so we're very happy to see a continued focus on getting funding appropriated for this purpose. The other bill that we were supportive of and submitted comment on this year is House Bill 1322, which is related to cottage foods. And the reason that this is important is that cottage foods are something that many small entrepreneurs are involved with, a lot of times in rural areas in particular. And so the state has a home processed foods law that basically allows for the production of home processed non-hazardous food. So food that doesn't necessarily need to be refrigerated, shelf stable, canned goods, those sort of things. They allow those to be produced without having to have a license. And so this update to the bill this year allowed for a broader range of foods to be produced under this law. And it also set aside some specific training that would replace a third-party verification. So previously you had to have your recipe for your home processed food. Every single recipe had to go through a third-party verification process. It's a little cumbersome. This will allow instead for the replacement of a food preparer's safety training that is inexpensive and widely available to give those processors the tools needed to be able to produce these foods. So it's really some great improvements that we were supportive and happy to see brought forward this year.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Kate, Tim, and Heidi for joining us today on the Rural Report to provide the updates on the legislative sessions. If you'd like to read more about the work done during the session, you can visit our website, cfra.org. We have a link to a page that lists all our legislative updates for the year. I will put that in the comment section here on Facebook if you would like to visit that. Also, just want to send out a quick thank you to all those who either testified in person via written comments or just worked with our staff on the issues that we've covered in Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota this session. That advocacy work is very important to the work we do here at the center, and it's very important for lawmakers to hear from residents, rural residents affected by the decisions they make each year. Again, thank you for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about the center, any events we have coming up, again, you can visit our website, cfra.org, or you can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. We continually share resources on those platforms and promote the events that we are hosting. So again, thank you again for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you during our next Rural Report. Have a great day, everyone.